Rome rose from obscure origins and came to dominate the Mediterranean world for several centuries. To this day, the imprint of the Romans is abundantly obvious throughout the Western world, as Roman influence did much to shape culture and institutions. Today we will look at Rome's early history, from the rise of the Republic to the end of the Middle Republic, that is to say, from the time when Rome was a small city-state in central Italy, to a time when Rome was the only major power in the Mediterranean world. We will explore the questions of how Rome rose to preeminence and why we know so little about its earliest history. When we consider the question of why the Romans had such an obscure early history, we have to keep in mind that they actually did not have a concept of history comparable to our understanding of it until about the 3rd century BCE, when they really came into heavy contact with the Greeks and upper-class Romans began to learn to read Greek and to read Greek histories. By the time that the Romans got interested in this, Rome had been around for centuries, and due to that lack of the historical discipline in their earlier years, they had not kept enough records for them to really formulate a factually sound account of their earliest history. Because of this, there was a good deal of debate about Rome's origins, and that was only really settled in the time of the Emperor Augustus, where he decided to kind of spruce it up a bit and make sure that Rome's early origins were, to put it bluntly, cool. We'll get there a little later, though. What we know from archaeology in the modern world, however, is that there were various small settlements on the 7 hills of Rome, and that these smaller settlements that were separate began to coalesce into a city as they grew off their hills and into the valleys in between during the 8th century BCE. And that is a significant time in world history because that is a time when the world was really entering the Iron Age in earnest, and where we see growth throughout the world. Climatic conditions were becoming optimal in most of the old world, and we see growth and cultural development all over the world, and the Romans are no exception to that. The Romans were on the northern end of an area known as Latium. This was an area dominated by Latin speakers, hence the relationship between Latium and Latin. And we know that ethnically speaking, the Romans were predominantly Latins. Although, because they were on the border of Etruria and the border of Umbria and also the border of the Sabine territories, they were heavily influenced by other neighbors as well. As I mentioned just now, the Romans were on the northeast corner of Latium, and because of that, they were more exposed to outside influences than most of the other Latins to the south. And because of that, they began to sort of perceive themselves as being somewhat unique or different from the other Latins. They had a very heavy influence from the Etruscans and Sabines. In Roman mythology, the Romans were themselves half Sabine because the early tradition is that King Romulus had a city of all men. They needed to find wives, and so they simply abducted women from the Sabines. Now, most likely this did not occur, but it does show that the Romans were very aware of their cultural debt to the Sabines. When it comes to the Etruscans, we see that there are innumerable parallels between Roman and Etruscan religious practices, and in fact, the Romans would continue to employ Etruscan soothsayers throughout their history. Despite all of the later efforts by Augustan-era writers such as the poet Virgil and the historian Livy to make the Romans the inheritors of Troy, it's clear that from Rome's language and culture, they were Latins who had simply borrowed very heavily from the Etruscans and Sabines early on, and then acquired other ideas and practices from the Greeks, Phoenicians, and others. The Etruscans, by the way, gave them their knowledge of aqueducts. Now, the Etruscans were not the only ones who practiced building them, but the Romans very much latched on to the Etruscan model for how to do it. They also were heavily influenced by Etruscan art. Later on, Greek art, Greek oratory, and then Greek disciplines such as history and drama and comedy would really become very prominent in Roman culture. As for the Phoenicians, the Romans learned from them how to build ships, and they also learned about the practice of crucifixion, which was something that the Carthaginians did on a regular basis. In terms of Rome's reluctance to acknowledge all of their cultural debts in an explicit way, that seems to be odd. The Greeks, for instance, were very open about the fact that they had borrowed very heavily from the Egyptians and from their neighbors to the east. The Romans, however, wanted to make themselves out to be as wholly unique as possible. So the question is, why would they do that? Well, we have to remember that in Rome, for much of its early history, down to about 90 BCE, they had really treated most of their Italian neighbors, including their fellow Latins, as second or even third-class citizens. The inhabitants of Rome itself had a higher legal status than the people that they conquered. And so part of the result of that is that they wanted to justify that privilege by saying that they were unique and different from people with whom they shared almost 100% the same culture. So in many ways, this was an effort by the Romans to create a distinction that was not immediately obvious and in fact didn't really exist, except as a legal category. In the Roman historical tradition, as recorded by Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and many other now lost writers, Rome had 7 monarchs between its foundation in 753 BCE and the birth of the Republic in 509 BCE. Each of these kings qualifies as a culture hero. A culture hero, in short, is someone whose contributions to a society really help shape its key institutions and beliefs. China has a number of culture heroes, including a king who figured out how to develop silk. The Greek polis had culture heroes, people who founded their institutions, men such as Solon of Athens or Lycurgus of Sparta, both of whom are kind of in the semi-legendary camp. And for Rome, their culture heroes were the 7 kings. The first king, Romulus, of course, founded the city and lent his name to the city. He also gave it its warlike spirit, so when the Romans were asked by others why they were so intent on conquest, they would say because they had inherited the spirit of Romulus, that Romulus had given them this character, and it was just part of who they were. Their second king is probably the most significant culture hero of all, however. His name was Numa Pompilius, and he laid down all of the norms for Rome's religious practices. In truth, these practices evolved over time and owed a great deal to outside influence, especially the Etruscans, as I mentioned earlier. However, the Romans themselves would consider all of their practices to be from Numa Pompilius. And this is something that was very important to them, that they had this early figure who had laid down these practices and that they had maintained those practices for centuries. And Numa's wisdom was proven by the fact that Rome continued to succeed, which meant that Numa had been correct about how to appease and appeal to the gods. Historically, there probably were kings in Rome, but most of them were not native Romans. So far as we can tell, most of them were probably Etruscan. And the reason for thinking that is not only because there are some Etruscan figures recorded in early Roman history who seem to interact with Rome a lot, such as Lars Porsena, but also because Etruria in general was at its peak during this period, and it was also expansionist against its neighbors. Well, Rome was right on the border of Etruria, and so it would be an obvious target for aggression from the Etruscans. And we know that the Romans borrowed very heavily from the Etruscans culturally and institutionally, and that would make sense if the Etruscans had ruled the city in its early history. There also are a number of key words in Latin that are borrowed from the Etruscan language, including the word milites, which means soldier. So, that's a pretty good indication, if something that basic is borrowed from a foreign language, that Rome had been ruled by this other culture. Otherwise, why would they have their word for soldier come from a foreign language? The last king of Rome was named Tarquinius Superbus, and although on the surface the term superbus might look like it means something like the superb, or that it might, say, indicate that this man had a super effective mode of transportation, in fact all it means is arrogant or proud. The Roman Senate felt that they were being oppressed by this man, and that he wasn't taking them seriously, that he was treating them with less than the respect that they deserved. In particular, the offense which drove the Roman aristocracy to distraction was that Tarquinius had a son who was even more arrogant, and he had raped a Roman noblewoman named Lucretia. She was sufficiently outraged by this that she supposedly went before the other noblemen of Rome and then asked them to avenge her. She said that her honor had been violated too much for her to continue living. Then she pulled out a dagger and stabbed herself dead. So the Roman aristocracy was spurred to action. They murdered Tarquinius' son and then drove Tarquinius out of town. That occurred in 509 to 508, and at that time the Senate as a body, which had started out as the king's old advisory council, began to govern the city together. So there was no more king. Now you had a ruling council, and this council was composed of wealthy families who had been originally appointed by the king. So you might think that because the Romans started out as haters of the king, that there wouldn't be much prestige attached to being a counselor of the king, but you'd be wrong. In fact, this became a special status. If your family had been in the Senate prior to the declaration of the Republic, your family was patrician, and this was a status that indicated a high degree of prestige. Patricians were thought to be a little bit more in touch with the gods, and there were certain religious offices that were only open to patricians even much later on in Roman history. Everyone else was a plebeian if you were not a part of the patrician order. Most of the plebs were poor, but often students get confused with the difference between patricians and plebeians. The difference is simply whether your family was in the Senate in the time of Tarquinius Superbus or earlier, or whether your family was not in the Senate in 509. It has nothing to do with how much money you have. Now, while most plebs were poor, there were other plebs who were actually quite wealthy, every bit as wealthy as the patricians, and over time, because as we'll see, a number of plebeians do make it into the Senate, the distinction between patricians and plebeians will diminish greatly, and by the late Republic, it is largely irrelevant. It will not impede one's career to be a plebeian. And in fact, when we begin our discussion of the late Republic, you'll see that the first two major figures of the late Republic are both plebeians. Early on in Rome's history, there was a major struggle between the patricians and the plebeians, and this was driven by a number of factors. First, the Roman patricians kept Rome constantly at war with its neighbors in an effort to acquire more land and expand. The problem with this is that while Rome was winning battles and gaining plunder, all of the plunder was being kept by senators. The plebeians themselves were being drafted into the army, and they weren't able to work, which meant that they were forced to take out loans in order to keep their families fed. So when they would come home sometimes from a successful campaign, they would then have to turn themselves over as debt slaves to their former commanders. Well, you can imagine that this didn't sit well with them. They did not think that this was fair or just. And that was really the driving force of this conflict in the earliest years of Rome, at least according to later Roman historians. How accurate their accounts are is anyone's guess. But we do know that there was a well-established tradition of a conflict between the two orders, the patricians and the plebeians. Another major factor is that there were plenty of wealthy plebeians who were angry that they didn't have a voice in government. The patricians had been sort of hogging the offices, and they would not allow new blood into the Senate. So that was another source of tension. Between 494 and 287, the plebs seceded from Rome 5 times. And what this means is that literally everyone who was not a patrician, meaning the vast majority of the population, almost all of the entire working class, and even a whole lot of the business class, and the vast majority of Rome's soldiers simply refused to work. They would leave Rome and force the patricians to make concessions. This was, in fact, a general strike, to put it in modern terms, where workers from all sectors of the economy strike all at once in solidarity. And each time the plebs would do this, they would win against the patricians, and they would force the patricians to compromise with them. Over time, by 287, these compromises had resulted in the opening up of the Senate to wealthy plebs, so now plebeians who had money could serve even as consul, Rome's highest office, and command troops in the field. The practice of debt slavery for Romans was ended. They also published laws in public, so that way officials could not arrest people for violating laws that they weren't aware of. That's not to say everybody could read, but at least in theory, the laws were available to everyone. They also allowed the people to vote for the magistracies. So now, although a lot of patricians still continued to hold office, at least the plebeians could vote for them, and this meant that the patricians had to sort of seek their support a little bit. We won't get into the details, but the Roman electoral system was still very rigged. This was not an election system which would pass muster with, say, the United Nations today as being free and fair. But it's still better than nothing. And there also was the creation of 10 new officers, all of whom were plebeians, and they would serve as tribunes. These men would be sacrosanct, meaning that they could not be harmed physically, or it would be an offense against the gods, and they were there to represent the interest of the common people. Over time, after these reforms, there was a period where there was some balance in the government and where the common Romans were somewhat well represented, but ultimately, by the time we get to the late Republic, as I mentioned, that difference between patricians and the wealthy plebeians had really become more or less meaningless, and the two regarded each other as a shared interest block. So there wasn't a lot of separation by the late Republic between patricians and plebeians who had money. They often intermarried, and this meant that the tribunes rarely did their job of protecting the poor because they no longer really cared about being plebeian, because it was all about being wealthy and being a member of the Senate. So this struggle did produce some results that were positive, but those results were short-lived because ultimately the wealthy plebeians would become strong allies of the patricians and abandon their fellow plebeians who had less money. But that is something we will circle back to when we get to the late Republic in the next lecture. Despite all of the early conflicts between the patrician and plebeian orders, Rome was still successful in expanding against its neighbors. However, this expansion was slow, tedious, and methodical. This was not something akin to the sweeping conquest of Alexander the Great. The Romans slowly but steadily expanded in all directions against their neighbors. The main stunt against their growth was Veii, a city to the northeast, only 10 miles away. And the Romans fought a long series of wars against the Veians, only finally prevailing and capturing the city in 396. By this point, Rome was the hegemon of central Italy. However, a lot of their progress would be undone by an invasion from the Senones, a Gallic tribe from the north. This was a grave humiliation for the Romans. They had never had their city captured by a foreign power, and King Brennus of the Senones only agreed to leave when the Romans had given him a sufficient weight of gold. The Romans felt deeply humiliated by this, and they began to entertain a deep fear of the Gauls, or sometimes they're called the Celts, but also they began to entertain genocidal desires against the Gauls. And that both of those things we will see reemerge in the next lecture, when the Romans are in a position to do something about the Gauls. In the meantime, the main problem is that Rome's Italian subjects, who had just been conquered, saw an opportunity to break away. So the Romans will spend the next 20 or so years putting down allies they had already conquered, and then completing their conquest after that. By the 340s, they had conquered all of central Italy, something that they were on the verge of doing before the Senones arrived. And as I mentioned, because of the sack of Rome in 387, the Gauls would now become the official boogeymen of Rome for centuries to come, even after Rome would acquire a, frankly, better boogeyman in the form of Hannibal Barca. The Roman legions became world-renowned for their conquest and for overcoming all of Rome's enemies on a wide variety of fronts on 3 different continents. However, it is worth noting that the legions were constantly evolving and that they changed considerably over time. We first see the formation of the legions as we think of them after the sack of Rome in 387. The Roman general Camillus reorganized the legions into maniples. And the manipular legions, despite not being as famous as the later cohort-based legions, were the Roman formations who conquered Rome's most obstinate enemies. This army was an army that was drafted from landowners, so it was not technically a professional army, but it fought frequently enough that it did have more proficiency than almost any force the Romans encountered. Because Rome controlled Italy, and Italy had a huge population relative to the rest of the Mediterranean, the manipular legions also were able to draw on a very deep manpower pool. The system founded by Camillus continued to evolve considerably, and our picture of that system is provided to us from the Greek historian Polybius, who was living in Rome, and he wrote around 150 or so BCE. So we see that army as it existed in that period. Men were organized by their age and wealth into various roles. The equites were wealthy Romans who could afford to outfit themselves as horsemen. They actually were not very effective, however. Roman cavalry tended to, frankly, suck. For Rome, its main arm was the infantry. And here we had the velites, who were men who didn't have many resources, so they were very lightly armed. They were effectively skirmishers who would throw javelins and then retreat. They also tended to be very young. Next up were men who had a little bit more money, but were also very young, the Astati. So these are men who are perhaps 18 to 22 or so, about college age. And they were supposed to do most of the fighting when the main lines would meet. So after the velites had retreated, the Hastati would be the first to stand and trade blows. If the Hastati couldn't get the job done, then the Romans would turn to the Principes. And as their name implies, they are the principal arm of the army. These are the best soldiers in theory. These are men who have a little bit more experience than the Hastatis. They're a little bit older, maybe mid-20s to late 20s, early 30s, somewhere in there. And if the Astati got in trouble, they would retreat through this flexible formation, allow the Principes to advance, and hopefully the Principes would carry the day. If even the Principes were overwhelmed, at that point the Triarii would step in. The Triarii were fewer in number because they were older. These are the veterans in the army. And they were also equipped differently. They had spears, so they were there for defensive purposes. And the role of the Triarii was either to provide stability and allow the younger men to rally and counterattack, or if need be, to stand and die while the younger men, who might not have reproduced yet, got away. But because these forces are drafted from the population, it meant that younger Romans would be ashamed to let the Triarii fall, since most of the Triarii would be their own fathers, or uncles, or neighbors, mentors. So this system produced armies that were very motivated to fight and were very flexible. We don't know exactly how they switched ranks when they would sub in groups, but apparently they were able to do this pretty effectively. And again, while this was not a professional army per se, the Romans drafted them often enough, and there were plenty of experienced men in the ranks, so these armies were still very high quality. And again, Central Italy had a deep manpower pool, so the Romans were able to literally stomp their feet and produce large armies. And their enemies found out over time that this made the Romans well nigh invincible. It was the manipular legion, rather than the more famous legions under Marius and then under the Empire, which really conquered Rome's most important opponents. Now that they were the masters of most of Central Italy, the Romans came into contact with the Samnites, who were eastern relatives of the Sabines. The Samnites did not fight as heavy as the Romans did. The Romans liked to fight head-on with heavy armor, whereas the Samnites were a little bit more lightly equipped and preferred to fight on rugged terrain. This meant that the Romans had to give chase to them and do a lot of pursuit and scouting, things that the Romans were not that great at. The Samnite Wars were a series of 3 wars fought between 343 when the First War began and 290 when the Third War ended, where the Romans did indeed eventually overcome the Samnites. The Romans learned to be more flexible in the course of these wars, and the manipular legions really evolved and improved as a result. The most famous incident from these wars was the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321. Here, the Romans were caught in a valley where they were completely hemmed in by the Samnites, and rather than destroy the Romans, the Samnites instead chose to allow them to surrender and then strip away their arms and send them home. They thought that this was a way to show the Romans that they could be trusted, one, and also that they were merciful. But the Romans instead took this as a grave insult and resolved to conquer the Samnites at all cost. So the Romans went on to eventually prevail in 290 after the humiliation at the Caudine Forks. Later on, the Romans honored the Samnites by creating a Samnite class of gladiator. So when they had their later gladiatorial games, they would have people equipped like either mythological or historical warriors. And one of the classes, one of the most popular classes, was modeled directly on the Samnite warriors from these wars. After defeating the Samnites, the Romans turned their attention to the Greeks of southern Italy. The Greek poleis in South Italy were incredibly prosperous, and for that reason alone were a highly tempting target. In addition, they were politically disunited, which meant once again that they were a tempting target. As the Romans began to win these wars, the Greeks in South Italy realized that they needed outside aid, and so they turned to Pyrrhus of Epirus, a cousin of Alexander the Great, who was looking for opportunities to create an empire for himself. He had been frustrated trying to become the king of Macedon, and so he turned to Italy to look for new opportunities there. He most likely thought that this would be a much easier endeavor than trying to gain the throne of Macedon, and in this he would be proven wrong. He brought with him a small but professional force, which was very similar to the army that Alexander the Great had used to conquer most of the known world. So for the Romans, this would be a great challenge of their skill, and it would either prove or break the manipular legion as a concept. During this time, where Pyrrhus was in Italy, he also spent some time in Sicily. He fought 3 battles against the Romans, and he managed to win all of them, each time with diminishing returns. The Romans, each time they fought Pyrrhus, came back stronger and more refined. This gave rise to the term Pyrrhic Victory, where someone wins, but the price of victory is so bad that they might have lost the battle. So a Pyrrhic victory is where you win, but the thing that you win is not really worth anything, or you suffer so much while winning that you would have been better off not fighting in the first place. After his third and final victory, Pyrrhus looked at his army and realized that he could not afford to fight another battle against the Romans without losing troops he couldn't replace. His army, after all, was composed of professionals rather than men who were drafted from the general population, and so he went home back to the Balkans, and the Romans then quickly finished up the conquest of the Greeks in the next 10 years. Their confidence after defeating a Hellenistic monarch with a Macedonian pattern army, of course, was sky high. The Romans now knew that their manipular legions were world class and could take on and defeat any opponent. In 264 BCE, the Romans intervened in Sicily in order to try to gain some territory at the expense of the Carthaginians. Prior to this, the Romans and Carthaginians had gotten along just fine, but now they would become bitter foes. The First Punic War would last for over 20 years and would result in catastrophic losses for both Rome and Carthage. This would be the ultimate test of Rome's resolve. Within just a couple of years, however, in Sicily itself, the Romans had more or less won the war on land. They had driven the Carthaginians back from their more advanced positions, and they had also made an alliance with the Sicilian Greeks under Syracuse, and so that part of the war was finished by about 262 or so. The Carthaginians were pinned on the west coast, and for the most part, the remaining land battles would be pretty small scale and of not much consequence to the Romans, even if they were life or death for the Carthaginians. Most of the war would now hinge on naval battles. This was something that Rome had never done before. Up to this point, the Romans probably had a small fleet, but one that was not terribly good or had ever really been tested. So what they did is they turned to their new Greek subjects from South Italy and ordered them to build a bunch of ships. The Greeks had a lot more naval experience and they could provide navigators and things of that nature. And so the Romans would outfit huge new fleets and sail against the Carthaginians. The expectation, of course, was that the Carthaginians, who were expert sailors, would easily whip the Romans, but instead the Romans turned the tables by using a device which was basically a boarding device, and it enabled them to simply flood the enemy ships with men. So the Romans actually won the early battles and destroyed the professional Carthaginian navy. However, after winning some of the early battles, a couple of their fleets were completely smashed by storms, and these ships, because of that boarding device, were very top-heavy and not very tenable in a storm. The Carthaginians also lost at least one fleet to a storm, and between these massive battles and storms, both sides would lose appalling numbers of men. Each ship contained 200 or more sailors, and if you factor in that sometimes in these storms over 100 ships could be lost, you can see how these losses would stack up and how this was also a major hit materially to lose not only all of these men, but also all of the money and resources that went into building large numbers of ships. At one point later in the war, it looked like Carthage was making a comeback and that Rome was at the end of its rope, but the Romans managed to win the last major naval battle, and then they were able to land a substantial army in Africa, and that spelled the end of the war. Carthage was forced to abandon Sicily, and so at long last, Rome had prevailed. They were pretty punitive about it. They blamed the Carthaginians for starting the war and forced them to pay a war indemnity for their aggression, quote unquote. A few years later, when Carthage's armies, which were mostly mercenary, came home, they revolted because Carthage was too broke to pay them. And while this war was going on, the Romans said that the Carthaginians were being too aggressive. Against whom is unclear, but the Romans, what it was is that the Carthaginians were planning to sail to Corsica and Sardinia to put down a revolt. The Romans said, no, clearly that navy is against us, so you're being aggressive, you have to give us Corsica and Sardinia, and you have to pay us even more money, so we're going to up the rate on your indemnity. And because of this act of basically betrayal by the Romans, the rivalry between Rome and Carthage got even more bitter and heated, and both sides began to slowly make preparations to renew the conflict at a later date. In order to pay off all of the war debts that they owed to the Romans, the Carthaginians decided to send their armies to Spain, where they would conquer the local tribes and take control of the various mines that were there. Now that they had a bunch of material wealth from Spain, the Carthaginians were able to pay off their debts and begin to recover. They never rebuilt their great fleet, but they were recovering substantially. However, the Romans caught wind of this, and far from being satisfied with the financial payments that they received, began to worry that Carthage would build up a great military power and seek revenge. So what they did is they began to intervene in internal affairs in Spain, and they threatened the Carthaginians by saying that they could not go any further north. Now, originally they had had an agreement with Carthage that Carthage could go up to the river Ebro, but the city that they tried to protect now was 100 or more miles south of that river, so it was a clear violation of the previous agreement between Rome and Carthage. Hannibal Barca, a young man who had become the commander-in-chief in Spain, decided that Rome's ultimatum was unacceptable and that Rome would eventually force them into war anyway, so he took his army and invaded Italy. He just marched overland through what is now France and through the Alps into northern Italy. This was a brilliant gambit. The Romans did not see this coming. They thought that they would simply send one army to Spain, one to Africa, win the war easily. Hannibal threw that calculation completely out the window. And what he did was he effectively forced Rome to defend Italy while also trying to go on the offensive against the Carthaginian base in Spain. So he created a two-front war and really threw Rome off its game. Hannibal is a military genius. He's one of the few truly brilliant generals in history. And his most substantial, or at least best-known victory was at Cannae. Here he had an army of maybe 45,000 men, and he stood them up on a slight incline to face a much larger Roman army of about 80,000 men. The Romans simply advanced and tried to steamroll his army, and then Hannibal was able to encircle that army with his smaller army and largely destroy the whole thing. So this was easily the most brilliant battlefield victory in history. Not just Roman history, not just ancient history, history. It's one that's still studied today in West Point and other war colleges around the world, even though it occurred more than 2,000 years ago. And yet, despite losing 70,000 out of 80,000 men in a single day, and I can't emphasize that enough, the rate of casualties we're talking about here. I mean, the rate of casualties here is greater than in World War I battles where men were literally charging into machine guns and artillery. Insane losses. But the Romans did not surrender. They refused. And so they slowly battled on and won a war of attrition against Hannibal in Italy, while also wearing out the Carthaginians in Spain and taking their base there. The general who emerged for Rome was a man named Scipio. And after he won the war, he became known as Scipio Africanus for winning a battle in Africa against Hannibal. But what he did is he conquered Punic Spain, so this took away much of Carthage's resources. And then he raised an army and invaded Africa and put a threat on Carthage, so the Carthaginians called Hannibal home to defend the capital. This resulted in a battle outside of Carthage at Zama, where Scipio won, and Carthage was forced to surrender. So the war ended after this battle in 202, and thus ends what is effectively the World War II of Roman history. This was their epic war that really defined who they were and showed the world the depths of Roman resolve. As in the First Punic War, they had suffered tremendous losses. Hannibal had also attempted to break away their allies, and he had some success doing that. But despite some of Rome's allies breaking away, the Romans had still managed to keep it together and ultimately to prevail. Despite the immense losses that Rome had suffered in both the First and Second Punic Wars, the Senate was determined to press forward and conquer the rest of the Mediterranean as quickly as possible. Part of the reason why the Senate was so hawkish in these years is because they had such a large number of veterans around. The Roman armies were never better than in the 15 or 20 years after the Second Punic War, when so many of their men had considerable military experience. And so it was during this period especially when we see the Roman legions really trouncing forces around the Mediterranean world. Despite the fact that the Roman population was anti-war at this point and thoroughly sick of it, the Senate managed to convince them to continue to go to war. In 200, just 2 years after the last battle of the Second Punic War, Rome fought Macedon. This was partly in revenge because Macedon had declared war on Rome after the Battle of Cannae. But it really was a voluntary war on Rome's part. And during that war, the Romans defeated a full-strength army under Philip V of Macedon. There were further wars, one in the 160s and another in the 140s, which first disbanded Macedon as a kingdom, so the kingdom of Philip II and Alexander the Great was now gone, and then later dismantled it entirely and absorbed it into a Roman province. At the same time, or not much after this, Rome was able to crush Sparta's last attempt to assert itself. Sparta had a tyrant named Nabis, who came out with an army and actually challenged the Romans to an open battle. He came pretty close to winning that battle, actually, despite being massively outnumbered, but he did lose, and after that the Spartans went quiet and never again really played a major role in even Greek politics. During these early conflicts with Macedon and Sparta, Rome at first allied itself with the Achaean and Aetolian leagues, but then later turned on them. They would find odd excuses and then fight a war against one or the other of the leagues, defeat it, and then order it to disband or to demilitarize. A little bit after Rome had dealt with Macedon for the first time, Antiochus III the Great rose to power in the Seleucid Empire and began to try to reclaim what his ancestor Seleucus I had controlled. And so he not only conquered a large percentage of Asia Minor, but then he began to become interested in Greece. The Romans intervened, and they intervened especially after they learned that Antiochus had hired Hannibal as an advisor. So the Romans sent out an army under Scipio's brother, and this army managed to smash Antiochus at the Battle of Magnesia, which not only prevented Antiochus from making it into Greece, but also forced him out of Western Asia Minor, the part that the Greeks had settled, and the part that is now part of modern Turkey. So the Romans not only stopped Antiochus III, but in many ways doomed the Seleucid Empire to enter into terminal decline. So after this point, the Seleucid Empire will no longer be any kind of threat to the Romans. At the same time, while all this is going on, throughout this entire period of the 190s down to the 130s, the Romans are also continuing to dispatch armies to Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. And these wars don't bring in the kind of plunder that the wars in the East bring in. These wars tend to be long and grinding. Spain does not have the material wealth of Greece. There aren't as many cultural artifacts to gain. But the Romans are slowly making progress and expanding there as well. However, these wars in Spain are deeply unpopular and cause a number of the participants there to go broke, since they aren't bringing home plunder to make up for the labor that they're not able to perform at home. Carthage survived the Second Punic War, although Rome prevented it from having any real military. However, despite being stripped of most of its territory and of both its navy and army, Carthage had become prosperous once again. The port was thriving, and the people there had accumulated wealth once more. Because of this, the Romans began to fear that Carthage would parlay that wealth into a new military and try to challenge the Romans for dominance again. One politician who had been a veteran of the Second Punic War as a young man used to end all of his speeches with the words, "Carthage must be destroyed," even if he was talking about something completely unrelated to Carthage or even foreign policy. And his views had become very popular. So, in order to preclude the return of Carthage to great power status, Rome initiated the Third Punic War. And effectively what happened is that they waited until the Carthaginians responded to a raid from their neighbors, the Numidians, by sending out an armed party, and they said, "We see you raise an army. That's an act of aggression and a threat to Rome. You must surrender," and they came up with some really steep, unacceptable terms. They came up with terms that Carthage could not possibly accept. And yet, Carthage actually did accept their terms at first. The terms were to hand over all of their weapons and a huge sum of money. And Carthage actually did it. And the Romans were flabbergasted because they assumed the Carthaginians would refuse. That way they'd have an excuse to march in and destroy the city. So they issued even more ridiculous demands, and finally the Carthaginians refused and melted down statues to get enough metal to make new weapons. So this resulted in a 3-year siege of the city, and eventually in 146 the city fell and was razed to the ground. In the tradition, in order to make sure that Carthage would never come back, the Romans sowed salt into the ground, which would supposedly prevent plants from ever growing again. In reality, the Romans would actually put a colony there about 100 years later, and a Roman Carthage would rise to be a great commercial center in the Roman Empire. And also, to really make soil untenable, there would have to be a long-term exposure to salt, not just a single salting for the purpose of making a statement, but that's neither here nor there. At the same time, the Romans also decided that their erstwhile allies, the Achaean League, were too dangerous to leave alive. Now, the Achaean League had been loyal to Rome for 50 plus years at this point. They had helped Rome fight the Aetolians, the Macedonians, the Spartans, and while the Achaean League had its own organization and army, they had never threatened Rome. But the Romans arrived in Greece right around the same time they were fighting the Third Punic War, and they said, "We believe that your very existence as a league and your federal army that you have is a threat to Rome, that you're planning to make war on us and try to reverse our gains. For national security purposes, you must immediately disband this organization, the Achaean League, and disband your army." And the Achaeans refused because they thought that this was unjust and ridiculous. So in order to make sure the Achaeans knew that they weren't playing, the Romans marched on the key city of Corinth and completely destroyed it the way that they did to Carthage. And this also occurred in 146. So the Achaean League was now gone, and one of the most iconic and important cities in Greece was wiped off the map. This shows the Roman way of war. Part of the Roman way of war, now that they were the dominant power, was to begin by issuing an ultimatum that was designed to ensure non-compliance. The point of this is so that way when the other party inevitably said no to the ridiculous demands of the Romans, they could then go before the gods and say, "We tried to keep the peace. We gave them a chance to escape, and now their blood is on their own hands because they would not accept our perfectly reasonable and clearly stated demands." The Romans called this us bellum, or just war. And all that is needed for a just war is that you issue an ultimatum beforehand where you offer up some terms that the other party can theoretically agree to in order to avoid a war. In practice, however, these terms were designed so that the other party would say no and allow the war to take place. And we see that most clearly with the Third Punic War, where the Romans got what they wanted and then still managed to force a war in the end. During the 2nd century, the Romans acquired large and lucrative new provinces. Roman revenues soared, and the opportunities for enrichment if you were either a Roman businessman or a Roman senator were becoming endless. We'll see that the wealth of the ruling class in Rome had already expanded greatly and would now continue to grow exponentially. However, Rome's rapid success came at a high cost at home. And this, of course, is not to ignore the high cost that the Corinthians, Carthaginians, and the Spanish tribes paid, which I think is obvious and goes without saying. But what's a little less obvious is that while Rome's ruling class did phenomenally well during the 2nd century, the working class, the common citizens and the non-citizens, didn't really get anything out of this. The uneven gains and inequitable sharing of the proceeds from Rome's conquest helped to drive significant tension between the classes and also between citizens and non-citizens. Romans began to resent their ruling class more, and citizens and non-citizens began to look at each other wearily as they knew that there was not all that much to go around, and the citizens were not willing to share what little they were getting with their non-citizen friends and allies who served with them in the ranks and suffered similar problems. Going into the late Republic, the greatest threats to Rome were almost all internal, and unfortunately, Rome would prove to be far less adept at political adaptation than they were at military adaptation. They would not evolve the same way, and in fact, we'll see that the late Republic will be a rather rough ride, which is surprising given that during the late Republic, the Romans didn't really have a geopolitical rival who was anything approaching an equal.